Welcome to Man Up, the podcast by men, about men, and for men who are striving to be better fathers, husbands, leaders, and followers of Jesus. Are you ready? Man up.
Yes, sir!
Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Man Up, your podcast with all the encouragement that you need to be a better father, husband, leader, and follower of Jesus. We're a band of brothers, we're soldiers, we're comrades in arms. We fight side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hand over hand, mile after mile, until each of us has helped the others attain the high calling of Jesus. And we are back. I had to take several weeks off because I couldn't breathe. For some reason, the allergies in the Pacific Northwest were worse for about a month and a half than they had been in Texas. And I just couldn't do the podcast for a good long while. And I've been using this time to sort of refocus, and I mentioned in the last episode I was going to be doing this, refocus on what this podcast means and how it could better serve our listeners. And today I'm joined by my good friend, Brian Hames, who's the co-host of our Biblically Speaking podcast. And I was just telling Brian that the new Man Up, what we're really going to focus on is the relationship between fathers and their children. We're going to get into marriages and other things like that, but I want the lens always to be, how do we be better fathers? Because let's face it, as men, if you're listening to this program, you're probably either are a father, have been a father, want to be a father, or going to be a father, or you're the son of a father. So fatherhood in some way applies to us all. And I want to kick off, sort of re-kick off the program with a doozy of an episode. Brian, today we're talking about anger. Our world's an angry place right now. Would you say so?
Yeah, but I have to say there's nothing new under the sun. You know, it's always been an angry place. Anger is a powerful motivator. It's easy to manipulate. You can get a lot done with it. You can, when I was in sixth grade basketball team, the coach kept harassing me, and because I wasn't playing ball well enough, and I got angry, and I ran in and took the ball away from the other team and scored a point. And that was all anger. You know, I got mad, and anger, and the coach loved it. So anger is a great way to motivate.
Sort of reminds me of that line in The Avengers when after somebody had asked Mark Ruffalo how it was that he controlled his anger, and the secret to being the Hulk was that he was always angry. That I think sometimes, I mean, we understand the principle of the carrot and the stick, right? That people are usually more motivated by what they want than what they're afraid of, but those are the two big motivations. But I think our world finds that it's much, much more enjoyable to use the stick on people who don't agree with us than the carrot. And that is something we have to be careful with as Christians. And I want to open this up with a passage from Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to share this onto the screen here. So Ephesians chapter 4, and this is right in the middle of Paul talking about the transition that they had made from people who were outside of Christ to those who were inside of Christ. It says in verse 25, "Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity." Let's talk a little bit about this, that as it pertains to our relationships with our children. How's the devil using our anger? How does he use anger against men? What are some of the problems that we encounter? What do we need to be aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, if we step back and we talk about anger, maybe the very first time we're going to meet anger is with Cain and Abel. The Bible's going to tell us about how it was that when Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices to God, one was acceptable and one was not. While it doesn't specifically use that word to describe the characteristic of what's going on, it just says his countenance fell. The conversation here, it does say angry. I'm sorry. So it does say he became angry and his countenance fell. Of course, we know what happens, right? Cain murders Abel in the end. He is cursed by God. First time we're introduced to the emotion of anger in the Bible, it brings about some pretty terrible results. And I really feel like that.
Well, and I think it's interesting, real quick, that in verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" So God is questioning not just the murder that he's going to go on to commit, but he's questioning the anger that he's living in. Why are you angry? And just bringing that out, it's up on the screen so that it supports you a little bit. But But continue, sorry.
No, and so it's just a great example of this statement that the anger of man doesn't produce the righteousness of God. And that's
right. Romans 12.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of
I'm sorry, James 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I was thinking about God being the source of vengeance in Romans 12.
that's right. That's
James
right.
1.
So, and the point is that that's a repeated statement throughout the scriptures about, our anger isn't going to accomplish anything useful. I know you might talk about zeal, but you have to separate zeal from anger. It's not necessarily the same thing, especially, zeal with knowledge. Zeal without knowledge, I guess, could be like anger. But the point is that anger is this emotion that is profoundly powerful. Maybe the only other thing that's as powerful is not the intellectual response of love, but the emotional nature of love. That might be the only other thing that's just as powerful. It motivates us to do
So let's
things.
riff on that for a second. How do we separate zeal from anger? I mean, right now we've got a lot of people that are very zealous for being angry in our culture. In fact, it seems to consume the nightly news cycle. It seems to be just all over YouTube and Facebook, and this kind of divisive anger is something that our country, particularly extreme left and extreme right-leaning people, tend to be very zealous for. How do we separate zeal from anger?
Yeah. Well, so for one thing, what we want to say is that zeal, and zeal itself can be a good or bad emotion, or going to give you a good.
Sure.
Zeal is probably an emotion, but it's an emotion that's rooted in some specific way of thinking. So, one of the best examples of zeal in a positive sense is Phineas back in the Old Testament. Whenever zeal motivates him to strike down the man sinning with the Moabite woman, and he saves Israel. And God says, wow, I'm going to make you the covenant of peace because you saved Israel by letting your zeal, get out there. Well, his zeal was this behavior where he was drawn to do the right thing because of godly reasons, because he understood the circumstance, he understood what was happening, he understood the danger presented, and he acted to destroy it. Another time there's positive zeal is Jesus when he goes into the temple and flips over the tables, and the Bible talks about that as I think in John chapter 2 it uses the word zeal, that the zeal has overwhelmed me. Again, God's house turned to a place of sin. Jesus is driving it out. Is it anger? Not exactly. Like I said, I want to be careful to say that zeal, it looks like anger and sometimes it feels like anger, but it's driven by a knowledge of I have to accomplish this. It's not for my satisfaction. It's to successfully accomplish a need. So those are two different things. But there is bad zeal. Paul says he was zealous in persecuting Christians because he believed bad information about the nature of Christianity. So he wanted to eradicate it, believing it was, something evil and something that was ungodly. And, that zeal was misdirected. And so, there's that sense where zeal can be good or bad. It depends, though, not on the motion, but the information. That's the issue that makes zeal righteous or unrighteous.
You're talking about Philippians 3. If anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the nation of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. Now, he's going to say in his letter to Timothy that he did those things in ignorance and unbelief, which is what you were just talking about there, that sometimes zeal is accompanied by ignorance. Now, you brought up two really good examples. I don't know how many people, when they heard the name Phineas, thought about the Old Testament Levite or the small orange-haired kid in Phineas and Ferb, because we don't talk about Phineas much, but God does tell him he delivered the nation. And one of the things that we have to be careful about when we sort of use that, or we use the idea of Jesus overturning the money tables in the temple, and we get involved in these cultural expressions of anger, is that when these things were done, they were done in very specific places. That you have, Phineas is purifying a nation that had been sanctified to God. Our country is not a nation that's been sanctified to God. If you're going to apply the example of Phineas, you'd have to do that in the church. That Jesus is overturning money changers in the temple that are deceiving the people, claiming to speak for God and claiming that God's okay with this behavior when he's really not. And that just going out and conveying anger, and I liked how you talked about the difference between zeal and anger, that going out and being zealous for anger is not the same thing that we see Jesus doing or Phineas doing. It was within the context of purifying something that God said was supposed to be holy that was being mistreated. and wasn't holy. And I think a lot of times and we talked about this in a recent episode of Biblically Speaking, a lot of times our political mindset, that the voice of politics is what makes us angry and not the voice of God. And that's I mean, the devil is constantly using those outside factors and motivations to try to lead us, even when it seems like we're zealous for good things, in a way that is going to be an expression of our anger and indignation rather than God's righteousness. But since this is Man Up, let's talk about how this kind of anger can affect our families.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ephesians chapter 6 says fathers are not to provoke their children to wrath. That Colossians chapter 3 says that basically the same idea there, that fathers shouldn't anger their children by being inconsistent. That how can our anger affect the next generation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times whenever people talk about their childhood and they talk about the things that they lament the most, they might talk about a father and the problems a father creates. Father kind of, in many ways, the captain of the ship sets the standard for what's going on. And if they describe having an angry father, they're never going to say, boy, my father was angry. It was a great childhood. They're going to talk about how that anger caused them to feel unworthy, to feel unloved, to feel anger. Anger is an emotion that pushes out a lot of other things, a lot of other positive feelings, and a lot of other positive engagements. Anger isn't intellectual. As I said, it's emotional, and it destroys the ability to have an intellectual connection with your children, which is what you really want. You want an intellectual understanding. You want to have a mind that's worth sharing with your children so that they can have some kind of thing to emulate. And anger is absolutely worthless. Anger has no value. It doesn't accomplish anything successful or good. Anger just doesn't, cause us to be better people. And as a father, as leader in the home, angry fathers have angry children.
And one of the things that I've noticed with my kid, and I've mentioned this before in the program, that Will is an empath. Lauren is an empath too. I am an introvert and somebody who is governed by my own emotions, and I live with two extroverts who are empaths. So I constantly have to be aware when I am frustrated, when I'm upset, when I'm depressed, when I'm angry. I'm not talking about clinical depression. I'm just talking about just having a general melancholy malaise about me. That both of those people are going to read, my wife and my child are both going to read into that I am those things toward them. And children in particular, I think that's part of what Peter talks about in 1 Peter 3 about living with your wife in an understanding way, that realizing how you affect her as the spiritual one who's been commissioned to be the spiritual leader of your household, that you have an effect on her, and not understanding that complicates her walk with Jesus and it's going to hinder your prayers. But even more so with our children who are just learning to navigate, and you think about the progression that children go through in the first 10, 12 years of their life. They're just mirrors. When they start getting into puberty, they start feeling those strong emotions themselves. And they go from being mirrors to using the information that you've given them to navigate the world. And those are two very difficult things to do. That when you are processing emotions for the first time and they're your own, and you're trying to navigate the world with the information that somebody else has given you, if they've gotten bad information on how anger should govern their lives, you've set them up on a very rocky road. And you haven't set them up in a way that shows them confidence in the Lord. One of the things that Jesus warned about early in the Sermon on the Mount, in fact, after you get out of the Beatitudes and you get out and you deal with the salt, light, city statements that are there in the in-between verses, the very first thing that Jesus said the Pharisees had been inconsistent on in their teaching was the sin of murder. He says, you've heard, you shall not commit murder. And I'm telling you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause, that he's already guilty of murder. And that's something that we don't think about. That when I'm out there and I'm angry at the world around me and I'm bringing that into my home, I'm amplifying the problem in the next generation, because there's always some level of control and rationality that I have, that I bring to it, that keeps me from acting out of anger. or keeps me from acting to the fullest extent of my anger, I should say. But what we see in the next generation over and over and over again is that where you don't have a good example of how to deal with anger, you don't have that temperament to say, okay, there needs to be a level of control. And a lot of the violence that we see in our society is born out of anger and indignation, and it is committed by people who don't know how to control those things because they don't have a good example of it.
Yeah. One of the issues about anger is self-control. And I think that's well worth your time to delve into. Typically, if I want to talk about anger, I love to go to the proverb that says, "A man without self-control is like a city without walls." You have no, you're going to be overwhelmed by every single thing that hits you. And anger is just one of many emotions, but as I said, it's perhaps one of the most powerful. Maybe you could debate it is the most powerful of the emotions that drive us to do things, to do terrible things. Genesis chapter 4. All sorts of passages in the Bible speak to people having acted in anger and then regretted it later. And the point is that without that self-control, without a control of my emotions, my heart, my attitude, I'm going to do something terrible almost every time. It may be small, it may be enormous, but it's going to be bad.
Yeah, the proverb that leads into that, and of course, this section of Proverbs are not really meant to be read necessarily as a long thought. They're more individual thoughts. But it's interesting that the two that come before that, it says, like a trampled spring and a polluted well is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked. It is not good to eat much honey. So, I mean, there's this idea of deferring to the ways of the people around us, which in a lot of ways, as we've already talked about, is what we're doing when we're responding to cultural anger. The next one says it's not good to eat much honey, nor is it glory to search out one's own glory. So that's that kind of self-righteousness, lack of self-control that you were just talking about. And then comes 25 and 28, like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit, even though you wouldn't say that those three proverbs are necessarily linked to one another in a causal sort of way. That progression of thought that Solomon has there in chapter 25 is exactly the progression of thought that you just expressed, that it's foolish to let someone else govern your emotions. It's foolish to seek your own glory, which is what self-righteous anger is really all about. And that if you don't have any control over those things, you're basically like a city that doesn't have any walls, which probably doesn't mean as much today in a free society. But a city without walls in ancient Israel was a bad thing because it was susceptible to attack by an army, and your citizens could just be slaughtered by people marauding with spears and swords and things like that.
Yeah. Maybe elaborate even on that to say a city without walls was a city that would never grow. It would never become anything. Nobody would ever want to be there. And think about the angry person. Do you want to be around them? Do you want to have relationships with them? And here's an important question that maybe every listener should think about. Are you an angry person? Are you angry about things that are going on in the world? Are you angry about things that go on in your life? Are you angry about people in your life that have said and done things? And here's the most important thing you need to appreciate and understand. Everybody's in the same situation on this, but some people aren't angry. Yeah. Meaning, anger isn't created by the circumstances in the world. Anger is created within you. You have the control over whether or not you're going to be angry. And if you choose to be angry,
that's a brilliant point.
Yeah, and if you choose to be angry, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to, let's go back to James one more time. You're not going to accomplish the righteousness of God.
Well, and isn't that what Paul was pointing out in Ephesians 4 when he says you're giving place to the devil? Don't give place to the devil. Be angry and do not sin. Anger is a part of life. You're not going to completely excise anger out of your life. But when you are angry, there is an open door that you've opened up a seat at the table for Satan to sit down. And it's easy for us to excuse our anger. Like you said, we can say, well, this person may be angry, or this company made me angry, or this political party made me angry. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said, no one can make you inferior without your consent. Well, Paul basically just said nobody can make you angry without your consent. So you can choose how to react to that. Lauren was sharing an article with me the other day about how sometimes loneliness and depression masquerade as anger. And that sometimes the people that we get that are short with us, that get angry with us, that push people away, that respond angrily, they're not really so much angry at the situation as they are trying to mask other deep emotions. And that's one of the problems, that when we bring it into our family is that we don't end up talking about the issues in our marriage. We just get angry. Or we don't end up talking about the issues between us and our children. We just get angry. That anger is an easy emotion to give into. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with my audience. I've done this. I've said this many times on this program. I have an issue with anger. Not that I am abusive or anything like that, but I actually am one of those people who enjoys being angry. It's fun. It makes me feel powerful. It gives me a sense of, I feel like, even though the Bible tells me I'm out of control, I feel like when I'm angry, I'm taking control of something. And nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not taking control. I'm actually giving up control, is what the Bible tells me. But it's one of those, that is a sin that I have to watch for every day of my life, because my first reaction to a lot of things is not to be a peacemaker. And yet that is exactly what Paul says we're supposed to be in Romans 12. We'll go over that passage in just a second. That's exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 5 and 9 is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. It is harder for me to be patient and listen and to not feel aggrieved and destroy a relationship than it is for me to be angry and burn it all down. And this led to a really big revelation about my life over a decade ago now. In fact, it's coming up on 15 years since I realized this. And that was, talk radio was really bad for me. And I'm not saying talk radio is sinful, but I am saying you should evaluate your relationship with talk radio and the 24-hour news cycle, left or right, I don't care which. That I was literally driving through traffic one day, and I'm using literally, not in a figurative sense. I'm driving in traffic, and the bumper sticker, I'm listening to a talk radio host named Michael Berry, who was going on about some political machination in Washington, D.C. that was supposed to make every right-leaning conservative American angry. I'm driving behind a bumper sticker that's got, or a car with all the bumper stickers in the world that could possibly disagree with me. And I'm in my mind, I'm formulating a lesson on loving the way Jesus loved, loving our neighbors, and I am angry at this person in front of me because I know they don't agree with me, and of course they're driving like an idiot, that I am angry with them, and I don't even know them. And I reached over and turned off talk radio, and I have never turned it back on. In fact, I am very cautious with all conservative media, even things like the Daily Wire, and it tend to be a little more benign. I'm very cautious with those, and sometimes I just turn them off because I know that for me, anger is a besetting sin, but it seems to be a sin, according to Paul, that trips a lot of people up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Boy, that's a powerful story. And it's a common story. I think lots of people need to acknowledge that they're angry more often than they realize. And it's interesting as you describe that. I think about the idea anger does make us feel good. It does give us a sense of satisfaction. It's the release of something, but a lot of times it's the release of something even worse. What causes anger? Why was Cain angry with Abel? Jealousy, envy, strife, hatred. Jesus talked about, we mentioned the passage of Jesus saying, you hate your brother, you're angry with your brother. A lot of times what fuels anger is something even worse. It's covetousness. It's all these things that we oftentimes can't even pin down in our life and say, I'm a covetous person. I'm a right. envious person. I'm a jealous person. Things that the Bible says no covetous person is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And we don't often look at ourselves and say, am I covetous? But anger is a fantastic determination of my sinful interior. And so that's something that really needs to be seen, is if I'm angry a lot, maybe there's something fueling that's going to keep me from the kingdom of heaven.
Well, and just like covetousness, we get it with covetousness. I mean, there are times when I flat out tell Will, for no reason at all, that no, you can't have this thing that you're wanting. because I know if I give in to everything that he wants, then it makes him covetous. He doesn't develop that self-governance to say, okay, dad is just saying not now on this, and I don't understand the reasons, but I'm going to accept it. And we've had to work with him a lot over the years. I mean, he's got grandparents that love to spoil him. He's got parents that, quite frankly, very early on loved to spoil him because it took us forever to have a kid. And so we understand to be careful with covetousness. But I think one of the sneaky things about anger when it comes to our children, and you were sort of bringing this up in your alignment or when you were talking about covetousness there, is that we sometimes anger feels right. And we almost, while we would never indoctrinate our children intentionally to be covetous and to embrace covetousness, I think sometimes we do intentionally indoctrinate our children to be angry and to respond in anger because we're convinced by outside influences that are, beholden to the prince of the air or the prince of the powers of this world, that that anger is somehow, in certain instances, righteous and necessary. And that's scary when you think about the relationships between fathers and children.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, you think of the idea of righteous anger. I think if you ask most people, hey, tell me, what do you think is a righteous anger? Oh, yeah, righteous. Well, then I'd say, well, where's that in the Bible? And
I'm going to go out and protest Target because I'm righteously indignant
righteous anger. It's not really a biblical idea. Like I said, zeal comes close, but zeal even isn't the same thing as righteous anger. Righteous anger isn't a biblical term. It's an idea that we've kind of come up with to say, well, I'm angry, but it's righteous anger. Well, anger is just an explosive emotion. It's just a lack of self-control. That's really the issue. Is there ever a righteous lack of self-control? Is there ever a righteous explosion of emotion? That's uncontrolled? I think we have to kind of question that idea and think to ourselves: can it be a good thing? And of course, somebody might say, "Well, Jesus was angry." By the way, it doesn't say he was angry when he tipped over the tables and such like that. That's not when Jesus. The only time the Bible says Jesus
zeal for his father's house consumed him.
Yeah, it says zeal, and again, we've already defined zeal is different than anger. But the only time the Bible ever mentions Jesus being angry, he was angry with his own disciples. Mark chapter 3, I think says it, that Jesus was angry with them because of the hardness of their heart. It says it grieved him. So what I want to say is anybody can be angry. It's not as though the moment you're angry, you sin. I think what's interesting about the passage you read earlier in Ephesians, he says, be angry and do not sin. And then he goes on to say, and put all anger out. Later on, he says, put all the anger out of you. Anger is just a feeling. It pops in. A lot of times that's how emotions are. They pop in. Covetousness, sometimes just kind of pops in. Hey, I want that, lust just pops in. Hey, I like looking at that, and your job is to say, but click, my mind, my heart takes control, or my mind takes control and says, no, that's not right. It's going to guide my heart away from that. Let me show you the right things to think about. And that's the concept that we have to have towards anger. Anger's a fire, and you cannot fuel it. You cannot give it the things to burn. And that's what it means.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of goes to what James was talking about in James 3 about the tongue. It's a little fire, but it can set on fire the whole world, and it's set on fire by hell. That's talking about the way we use our tongue in anger. But I was thinking about when you talked about emotions popping in and being unable to control those. I think that's why Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. And I say Paul, that's why the Holy Spirit commissioned Paul to say that the emotion is going to come. The problem is when we live in that emotion. It's just like Mark chapter 4. You mentioned Mark 3, but Mark 4, when the disciples are in the boat and they wake up Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? The problem wasn't that they had a moment of fear. It's that they lived in that fear long enough to say, Jesus really doesn't care about us. And we better call attention to the fact that he doesn't care about us. That's the same thing that anger can do. And Jesus had these moments of frustration. I think about in Luke, when he came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and this crowd is gathered there, and the Father has been stirred up by the Pharisees to say, I asked your disciples to do something about this, and they couldn't do anything about it. So if you can do something about this, Jesus gets a little indignant with the guy. He's like, if I can do something about this, look, dude, you came to me. I didn't come to you to say, hey, your kid is sick. You came here because you know I can do something. Something is eroding your faith right then. And it was his anger, his indignation had eroded his faith. And what did he say? Lord, I do believe, help my unbelief. That anger erodes our faith, and that can affect our relationship with our kids. You mentioned righteous indignation a moment ago, or righteous anger, that I was thinking about where that phrase actually shows up in Scripture, and the closest I found was Psalm 7, verse 11, which says, God is a righteous judge and a God who has indignation every day. So God is grieved and made indignant every day by our sin because he's a perfectly righteous judge. So when we talk about righteous indignation, we're taking something that belongs to God and we're taking it for ourselves. And that's something that all over Scripture is a big no-no, that you don't take what belongs to God for yourself. And if you really want to drive this point home, I'm going to share my screen here, that you just have to look at what he says, and we just talked about this in a Biblically Speaking episode, what Paul says in Romans chapter 12. When he says, here's how the living sacrifice is Christian, the one who shows that he's honoring God as a living sacrifice, here's how he should conduct himself. Verse 14 says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another, do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly, do not be wise in your own estimation, and never pay back evil for evil to anyone. So that's how we're supposed to respond. Don't repay evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men, if possible, so far as it depends on you. So as much as you can bring to the situation, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, and I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. And do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So right there in the middle of this, don't take your own vengeance, don't repay, leave room for the wrath of God, because vengeance is his, and he will repay. God's promised that. He says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The emotion of anger there, when it's lived in to the point that we are seeking our own revenge and the expression of our anger, is called evil. It says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What's the lesson from that?
Yeah, the whole concept is whenever I'm provoked to anger, and let's even call it I'm provoked by sin, not just my pure sinful condition myself, my covetousness. Let's say I am provoked to anger by the sin of another. That might be as close as a righteous person can come to saying, where an anger has a sophistication. What am I going to do with that? How am I going to respond with that? And my anger, the anger of man, has to be channeled in a different way. Anger usually doesn't promote the idea of having a kind, loving conversation with someone. So right away, I have to kind of acknowledge that I'm going to have to change my feeling about things. One of the things I always think is interesting is that when Jesus would look on the lost, and he'd look at this mass of people that were just rotten people, and I have to say I'm ashamed that I am not more Christ-like in this, because let's say I'm driving down the road, in our area, the Portland metro area, we got a lot of problems with drugs, with vagrancy, with people, and when you have vagrancy, you have trash everywhere, and you have, a lot of drug problems, and it's kind of, I get angry. Let me just say, I get kind of, I get frustrated. Jesus, the Bible says, when he looked at those things, the Bible says he has compassion because he saw sheep without a shepherd. Brian needs to work on that. I've got to figure out how I can change anger to compassion, how I can change my feelings of, I wish these people would get their act together. I wish they would clean up. I wish they would, don't they care about the way they're living? to a look at these people. They just don't know. They don't know the love of God. Look at these people. They just don't understand. They're sheep without a shepherd. They're just wandering and they're hopeless and aimless. And Jesus could have compassion. And by the way, if you don't think that's true enough, think of like Romans 5 when he says, "While we were yet in sin, Christ dies for the ungodly." That's how God is looking at the earth.
Oh yeah.
As a
He goes on to call us enemies then.
Yeah, that's right. That's the word he uses. And,
enemies of God.
And here's God looking at the earth saying, this place is so gross. He gave it a good washing once, and that didn't even clean up the sin, And so what's he going to fix it? He's not going to fix it by, I'm going to burn it up this time. He says, I'm going to send my son. I'm going to give him a shepherd to follow. And that's the way that's the mind we're supposed to have, is a mind that in almost every situation where I'm angry, I really should be compassionate. And that's tough for me. I really struggle with that.
Yeah. I've got to share this. It's a segue from what you're talking about, but we were driving through downtown Beaverton, several times this week. It was last Sunday. I think it was the first time I noticed them. That, and you probably know where I'm going with this already, but the pride buntings are out all over. Excuse me. At a time when our entire nation is sort of backing away from that conversation and saying, maybe we need to reevaluate how far we've gone with this. Beaverton is out there letting it all fly. And I'm driving through there and I'm just feeling more and more angry about it. And I sort of prayed about it in the moment. And about that time, Will goes, "What are all these rainbows for?" I said, Beaverton just likes to really remember God's promise that he's never going to destroy the world again with water.
That is awesome.
He goes,
yeah, that is awesome.
He goes, "Oh, okay."
Yeah, that is awesome.
But it would have been so easy to communicate anger in that moment and to make him angry. And that's one of the things that I mean, as he's reaching the cusp of those years where he's going to start making those kinds of transitions in his life, the governed by his own emotions kind of thing, as his body starts to change and his mind starts to change. And I know we're right on the cusp of that it's coming in a few years. That these moments are the moments that he's going to internalize where if dad's angry about this and expresses anger all the time, then that's my go-to. And that's one of the things that we have to be aware of as fathers. You mentioned the flood in juxtaposition with fire, and it got me to thinking about Luke chapter 9. Let me share my screen here again so everybody can see this if you're watching this on the video podcast. But Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 51, it says, "When the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem." This is talking about Jesus. "And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem." The Samaritans, 99 times out of 100 were glad if anybody came through the village. But, Jesus is going down for the Passover, and they don't really like that because it's kind of a condemnation. So they're like, "No, we don't want your teacher, this Jewish teacher to come through our village today." But they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. And his disciples, James and John, saw this. They said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to..." Let me read this in my man up voice. "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went on to another village. So here's this moment where the disciples of Jesus are angry on his behalf. I mean, how many times do we feel like our anger is on behalf of Jesus? "Do you want us to consume them with fire? Do you want me to go out and drag my kid to a protest, Lord? Do you want me to go and yell at people who don't know you and don't understand you and scream at them that they're going to burn in hell because they don't know you or understand you? Is that how you want us to behave, Lord?" It says Jesus rebuked that spirit. He says, "You don't know what spirit you are of. You know, a lot of even the preaching today that gets done is, rather than calling people to hope, and I'm not saying that hell does not have a place in the discussion. It clearly does. Jesus talked more about hell than anyone. But a lot of the preaching that gets done today towards sins that make us really angry is focused on hell and damnation rather than hope and coming out of the sin. And maybe, just maybe, we're of the wrong spirit. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, that's heavy. I love that example. That's a really profound idea of Jesus says, I didn't come to destroy people. I came to save people. That really hits home. You know, like I said, because you feel like there is some kind of natural reaction, you know, that's good in that, in being angry because of wickedness. They just insulted Jesus, you know. How many times today are people insulting Jesus around us? And, you know, we even wonder, should I be more angry? You know, and Jesus, I didn't come to be angry with them. I didn't come to destroy them. I came to save them. You know, and that's the spirit you need to have. That's a really great illustration, I think.
So let's talk about anger and how it affects our kids. That we've sort of touched on this a few times, but let's sort of spend the rest of the time talking about that. You've mentioned it. I've mentioned it. What are some of the dangerous stumbling blocks that come from anger? What are some things that we need to watch out for in our kids that might show us that we're not being a good example of how to control anger? How do we correct that?
Anger necessarily contains an element of fright and fear and terror, especially towards children. Because when you're angry, you might do something that a rational person wouldn't do. That's intuitive.
Yeah.
Small children know that. Whenever a dog barks at them, they'll step back because they know the dog's reacting in a way that they don't understand. It's scary. So right off the top, let's appreciate the idea that anytime I demonstrate anger to my kids, it's going to scare them in some way. You know, even to this day, you know, my children are adults. But if I get angry in front of them, that makes them at the least uncomfortable. You know, it's frightening. So right off the top, appreciate the idea that angry fathers traumatize their children. They give their children a fear that doesn't really go away. You know, a sense of a lack of stability that undermines your credibility and your authority. Because, like I said, if you want to be a good father, what you're trying to do is to convey a way of thinking, a pattern of thought, a mindset or philosophy. And you know, of course, we want that philosophy to be the philosophy of Christ, the mind of Christ. But you want them to learn a way of thinking that you're supposed to be mastering. And anger completely undermines your credibility that your philosophy keeps you in control. They need a philosophy that's going to be something that they can apply to all aspects of their life. Anger is your way of saying, well, there's some parts of my life that Christ can't control. And so you're undermining the cause of Christ whenever you're angry. Whenever you speak in anger, whenever you act in anger, whenever you, which typically it's speaking in anger. You mentioned James being all about, James is all about the mouth. You know, James talks about how, that's from the first to the last chapter of the book of James. Every chapter has something to say about what we say and how we talk. And the mouth is just such a profoundly important characteristic. And with anger, the mouth is oftentimes given a free sense to say what it wants to say, to blaspheme, to insult, to speak evil of. And every one of those things lowers your credibility and accountability. I think, like I said, we just don't appreciate how damaging anger is to our influence in the lives of our children. And like I said, when our children are small, and I've said this many times, and I'll say it again, when our children are small, our influence is a little more substantial. We can kind of control and direct them. But after they hit adolescence, we lose that control. They become their own person, and we have to rely on the influence that we have to help them to grow into something. And if you've damaged your influence with anger, when they hit adolescence, you will not have enough influence in order to direct them to make the good choices they make when they're as an adult. So that damage of influence, I just can't say it enough. Anger is one of several things that utterly damages that influence. You cannot let it cannot let it manifest itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that, and I think about one of the reasons why my expressions of anger are the way that they are, and as much as I, admitted earlier to enjoying, feeling angry, and that's something I have to watch for. The expressions of anger are always governed, even when I'm at my angriest, and that's not a pass. It's not saying it's right to be angry, but I learned that from my dad. I never heard my dad swear when he was angry. There was never a pass when he was angry for being violent toward us. In fact, he was very careful to discipline us in moments when he wasn't angry. And we understood at an early age the difference between stern and he's talking to us in this voice, and angry, which I never heard him use that voice. And that's one of the things that I've had to tell Will, is that sometimes, as your father, I've got to be stern with you. It can't just be, hey, buddy, do better. It's, look, you really need to shape up. There's an issue here, and you need to open your ears. Well, Dad, I'm sorry I made you mad. He thinks that that's mad. I'm like, son, you didn't make me mad. I'm trying to communicate the truth of the predicament that you're in. And I learned that from my dad. But many, many people learn from their fathers these kinds of negative expressions of anger. Even Christians will say, well, yeah, my only time I ever heard my dad cuss was when he was angry. Okay, well, that's not a good thing. That means anger was out of control. That and our children internalize that. And particularly when we have sons, not only are they going to internalize that, that's their pattern. Mm-hmm. They're going to imitate that. And whatever measure of control we lose when we're angry, and I say this because you see this with David and Solomon, that what the fathers permit, the children run to in excess. Whatever measure of control, self-control we lose when we're angry, you can multiply that in our children when they become adults. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why we're seeing so much violence in our young people today, is that a lot of them grew up in homes without fathers. A lot of them grew up in homes with fathers who thought the idea of fatherhood was just working. A lot of them statistically grew up with abusive fathers. And now we have children that are acting out of control in ways that are sometimes dangerous and harmful to others. And much of it stems from the fact that they never had a good example of what it meant to be angry and how to navigate that in a godly way.
Yeah, that's really really important to understand. And again, angry fathers have angry sons, and angry people do terrible things. And the point is, one day a father looks at his son, and his son is doing something ugly to his family. That's the cats in the cradle moment. He's my boy's just like me.
My boy's just like me. Yeah, absolutely. So real quickly, in the time that we've got left, and you sort of touched on this already, part of it is understanding the difference between indignation and zeal and anger. How do we avoid bringing outside influences that make us angry into our homes and internalizing them and affecting the family dynamic, be it the relationship we have with our wives, the relationship we have with our children?
Number one, I think every person has to acknowledge you don't put anger out of your life. It is an emotion that is rooted in the flesh. And as long as you've got flesh, you're going to have anger. Sometimes people say, well, I'm just not that kind of person. Every human being is that kind of person. And maybe you have better control over it than others do. Maybe it's less likely to pop up. But the point is, every person needs to acknowledge anger, because it is a work of the flesh. It's in every human that is in the flesh. And it's, like I said, it's not that anger is of itself purely a sin. It pops up. And you have to, first of all, acknowledge, number one, it pops up, and I can be an angry person. I can be that person. And number two, you have to, by acknowledging that, say, what am I going to do when I get angry? How am I going to diffuse that anger? Number three, what is provoking my anger? I said a lot of times anger is provoked by by sins that we're not aware we're committing. Whether it's covetousness, envy, lust, these
Mm-hmm.
sins that oftentimes have an emotional linkage. Anger is certainly fueled by that, but it also could be triggers. You gave such a great illustration earlier of realizing that the world around you, and one way you were engaging it was a trigger. But we get angry all the time, and I think one thing is with news, with politics, with things like that, they're actually intending to trigger our anger. That's actually their goal, is to provoke an angry response. It's to provoke an
Mm-hmm.
attitude of anger so that they can then manipulate us and make us their power base. They want to turn us into a battery where our anger is fueling their machine. So they're going to do whatever
Yeah.
they can to provoke our anger. We need to appreciate that and understand that, and either A, not engage with it at all, or B, at least engage with it in an extremely careful way, knowing that it's a system designed to provoke anger and to make us sin.
Yeah.
It's like watching a rated R movie. It's all these things that are our direct engagement with something that wants to make us sin. Oftentimes, what
Yeah.
we don't appreciate is that these and as I said, political radio is a great example. Political anything is really a great example. Politics wants to harness anger for power, and all of us
Mm-hmm.
have to be aware of that manipulation. So just a couple of things to start off with there. That we acknowledge we're angry people. Everybody can be angry. We try to determine what is the cause of our anger, and then we try to figure out ways that we can diffuse our anger.
I like how you talked about that, because that it's almost like the scene in the movie where the guy opens a suitcase and realizes the bomb is in it, and he's got to defuse the bomb. What's the first thing he does? He gets people that can't help alleviate the situation and are the most danger away from it. Right? He carries it somewhere else, or he says, "Everybody, get out!" before he starts cutting the red wire. I love how all the bomb makers in the movies use the same wiring scheme.
That's useful.
Yeah, it's like, oh, cut the green wire. Well, how do you know? What's the green wire? What? What if he used all black wiring?
Yeah, that's right.
But it's that kind of thought, that realizing, okay, this is a harmful influence. If one morning, I don't know why, we were living in Centerville, Texas at the time. I woke up at about 3 a.m. And I don't know why. It may be that one of the dogs sort of woke me up. And I just had a sense that something was wrong in the house. And I started moving through the house. And in my entry hall, this is a true story, there was a copperhead, a venomous snake. Not a very big one, but a venomous snake. I was not going to go to bed. It was just me and Will at the time. Lauren was out of town. For some reason, I wasn't going to go back to bed knowing that the influence of that snake was in my house. I beat it to death with a shoe, if you want to know. It wasn't that big of a copperhead. It wasn't full grown. It had just had the smallest little bit of yellow left on its tail, which, if you know what a yellowtail copperhead is, that means they're really young. I beat that snake to death with a shoe in my entry hall. And I was indignant, because I hate snakes. I was indignant that snake was in my house. But the indignancy wasn't about how dare it come into my house. I was fearful of the kind of influence that it was bringing in. And I would suggest, and I liked your illustration of the rated R movie, I would suggest that that's exactly how we handle anger. That understanding that anger and indignation are part of life. There's nothing you're going to do about that. You're going to get angry about things that are happening in the world. But it's an influence that you need to keep out of your house. And that's why constantly marinating in the cancel culture talk, or the boycott talk, or these Democrats are driving the country downhill, or Republicans, if you're on the other side of the fence. If that's where you live, you're allowing a poisonous influence to be a part of your of a place that's supposed to be where our children learn about the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And I would say that that's an influence that we need to beat to death to keep it out of our house.
I love that.
I didn't like finding a copperhead.
No, I think that's I think at that point I sell the house and I move to Nebraska.
Where you can deal with rattlesnakes.
Yeah, that's right. Rattlesnakes are much better to deal with than copperheads.
At least they let you know they're coming.
Right? They actually they have as much problem with us as we have with them. Copperheads do not respect us.
Yeah. Well, I think we covered the topic of anger pretty well. There's a lot more that we could say on it, but it's we're trying to keep the programs under an hour. You got anything you want to wrap up on?
No, I just think this is important. I tell you what, appreciate anger has a lot more influence in your life than you realize, and it is no good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to come. You're going to get angry about things, but that's not the place where you want to live.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to thank Brian for being here. He's my co-host on the Biblically Speaking podcast, if you haven't checked that out. But on Man Up, he's here as a guest today. So everybody thank Brian for being here. But for all of us here at Man Up, I want to thank you for being here. And as always, we want to say, have a good day, God bless, and man up.
Dismissed!